Today, we're looking at the fourth of the 8 faction leaders that'll be playable in Total War Pharaoh at launch, the powerful Tausret, who managed to survive more crises than any of the other leaders in the time period, navigating deftly into a position of becoming only the 4th female pharaoh in Egypt's long history. She knew better than anyone how to make herself useful, even to opposing political factions, and ultimately showed no signs of hesitation when the opportunity for the crown presented itself, and even, if the artwork can be believed, took to the field of battle personally to defend what was hers. Our story, as usual, starts right around 1200 BCE. Pharaoh Merneptah, the last of the 19th dynasty who really had Egypt under control, has died, and his son Seti II has taken control, though finds himself opposed by Amen-Messa down in the south, and various other minor threats on his other borders. It's possible that Tausret is relatively young at this point in her life, perhaps 18 or 20 by some estimates. She is a descendant of Ramesses II, probably a granddaughter, since she never claims the title King's Daughter. This, by the way, is also why Wikipedia, as of the time of me recording this, is mistaken in claiming her to be the daughter of Merneptah, for that too would qualify her for the King's Daughter title, which, given the rest of her career, she should have been expected to trumpet loudly and often for some much-needed legitimacy points. The first we hear of Tausret is her royal wedding to Seti II. Something goes wrong with Seti's previous wife, Takhat. Perhaps she simply has died, or perhaps she's been set aside due to some scandal. I hate to implicate Tausret in Takhat's downfall, partly because there's so little evidence, and partly because scheming royal wives is a pretty negative and often slanderous trope from ancient historians. And yet, we sort of have two ways to read Tausret's career. Either that she was a master schemer who manipulated events to increase her power, or that she was mostly passive and lucky, rising to queen because the men around her found it convenient. Elements of both may be present, but I'm mostly going to see her in this video as an active driving force in her own fate, not merely lucky, because I don't think you can become pharaoh during the most contentious period of the New Kingdom just by luck. Anyway, we don't hear explicitly why she was chosen to be Seti's wife. It wasn't a love match, nor was it about anyone's great beauty. Her being attractive and able to bear children would have been a baseline requirement for marriage to a sitting king. Similarly, her bloodline was appropriate, but given how many children Ramesses II had fathered, perhaps around 100 over his very long and very polygamous life, the ranks of royal grandchildren must be absolutely swollen with attractive daughters at this point. A major factor here would have been her father, whose identity we don't know, but who would have been a major player in courtly politics, having been given a senior government position by Ramesses. While her father likely had some sort of wealth and estates, this isn't Seti marrying into the landed nobility, so much as it was him allying with one of the levers of power, someone who controlled a government department or a military division. It's not the Middle Ages here, and Egypt was not a feudal realm. But of course, if Tausret was involved in Takhat's downfall, then she would also have had some other advantages up her sleeve to bring to the table. But maybe this one really is just a bunch of luck. A woman with mere potential, enabled by chance to turn that into something greater. Because we don't know of anything she accomplishes while married to Seti. She does perform the most important task of a royal wife, bearing a son, but this child doesn't seem to survive his first few years. And no need for a conspiracy here, this is a depressing but common fact of life in the ancient world. Of course, that doesn't mean she had no accomplishments in this period. It would be remarkably odd for an ambitious wife to be allowed to be publicly seen acting in an administrative role. People would start to think that Pharaoh wasn't absolutely in charge of his household, as he is of the nation. And so maybe she was kept wholly in the dark for the next 4 years of her life, but most likely, whether she was active behind the scenes or not, she was learning a good deal about how the nation worked, even or perhaps especially while on the run from Amenmessa's army in the Nile Delta for 2 years. Once Seti dies, Tausret is left in a lurch. The first great phase of the civil war, Seti versus Amenmessa, has ended, and Egypt was left with no obvious candidate to lead the nation. By this point, there's a thought which exists in Tausret's head that goes something like this. I'm a granddaughter of the Pharaoh. I'm a wife of a Pharaoh, and I've either seen or participated in government directly during a severe crisis period, navigating both the capital and an exile. Why am I not an obvious candidate to lead the nation? But of course, every time she thought about that, she remembered her gender, which was not immediately disqualifying, since 3 other women over the previous 2,000 years had had turns wearing the crown, but it was pretty discouraging nonetheless. But at the decisive moment following her husband's death, she did not hesitate, even though the death seems a bit unplanned for, if not completely unexpected. She reached out to a key member of her former husband's council, a Syrian named Ramesses Khaimnetjer Bey, and the two formed a governing coalition. Together they had a good bit of experience and a good bit of contacts, but they needed one more element, a more legitimizing claim to the throne. And so they pick a 10-year-old boy with a disabled leg who was perfect in 2 ways. First, he seems to have been largely incapable of accomplishing any governing on his own, and would thus need at least 1 regent, if not 2. Second, there's a good chance that he was Amenmessa's son, and having 2 senior members of Seti's faction backing the son of his rival Amenmessa, well, that's exactly the kind of bridge building that appears to be lost on modern politicians. The triumvirate did not actually unify the country in any meaningful way, but they were able to cobble together enough support to hold the core of Egypt. And with this base of power, they together accomplish not a whole lot. All 3 of them build tombs in the Valley of the Kings. This is completely expected for Sipta, who actually is king, a bit unusual for Tausret, who under most circumstances would have her tomb in the Valley of the Queens, but actually seems to have been granted a spot in the more prestigious valley by her husband, and work on that tomb continues apace. Now, it's most shocking for Chancellor Bey to be given a tomb in that valley, but we cover that in his episode, which is already released. They are not completely worthless as rulers. We do see them building various monumental structures. Not a whole lot, but a fair amount, and this sort of construction is one of the key pillars of ancient kingship. And we know they still had an army, and must have been doing their level best to prevent Egypt from being overrun by increasing external threats. Though the fact that we never hear of any victories on that front suggests that we're looking at almost a decade of uninterrupted defeats. Internally, later Egyptian histories record that the country was sliding into chaos, with rampant banditry and an overall breakdown in order starting to feed on itself, as more unsettled conditions cause more people to turn to crime or lose their livelihood, thus increasing the overall unease in the country. These later histories are biased. They hate the entire triumvirate and typically omit them entirely from kings' lists, but at the same time, there likely was a good bit of foreign invasion and domestic unrest from what we can tell of the period. And in this, the common folk are merely imitating their leaders. We don't hear about it directly, but there must have been a significant amount of blood flowing in the palaces, much of it royal. The core issue is that Ramesses the Great, Tausret's grandfather, had somewhere around 100 children, plus or minus a bit, a consequence of living 90 years with a large number of wives and women. And yet Tausret and Bey are able to elevate a 10-year-old cripple, then Tausret herself, to the crown, which suggests that any others in the royal lineage are either dead, unwilling to risk confrontation, or already in the process of losing or hiding from such a confrontation. It's a great setting for a game called Total War, but maybe not a great time period to actually live through. Anyway, we do hear about one death in this battle royale. After 5 years of Siptah's kingship, Tausret's co-regent Chancellor Bey dies, at the orders of the king, or whoever was writing the king's orders. We aren't saying that Tausret was responsible for this, but we aren't also saying that she wasn't. Then, maybe a year or 18 months later, Siptah himself dies. Now, he was a young, sickly kid. No one would blame him for shuffling off the mortal coil, and certainly the figure acting as his royal mother, though she definitely wasn't his mother, would never wish for anything but the best for the boy. But it is interesting that right as he was reaching the age to make his own decisions and to let the regency fade away, the other major power block was eliminated, and then the boy himself flew up to meet the Egyptian afterlife gods. Did Tausret have anything to do with Siptah's late-term abortion? Whether or not she did, she certainly doesn't seem to have been bothered by it. As soon as the boy was dead, she plucked the crown off his brow and placed it on her own, insisting that nothing at all had changed except the gender of the king. And as shocking as a ruling queen could be in the ancient world, Egypt did have precedent for it. 3 precedents over the past 2,000 years. Which isn't a lot, but the most recent of those, Hatshepsut, was only 2 centuries prior and was one of the more significant rulers of the New Kingdom period. So there was a decent enough template for female rulership in theory, which Tausret seems to have followed in general. The fundamental issue, from a legitimacy standpoint, was balancing the inherent maleness to the Egyptian kingship with the femaleness of the occupant. And so, though our evidence for Tausret is much less than what we have for Hatshepsut, we see both famous women kings sometimes using masculine language and artwork to depict themselves, and sometimes using feminine. Because it is, in one sense, wrong to call them famous Egyptian queens. There was no queenship in Egypt, at least no ruling queenship. The ruler was king. And that word was inherently masculine, both in the sense of grammatical gender and in the sense of just conceptual categories. Obviously, the fact that king sometimes referred to a lady points to a flaw in the conception of Egyptian kingship from a modern perspective, though an ancient Egyptian would say that the flaw lies not in the office of male kingship, but in the aberration of female occupants therein. The details of the gender politics, or Tausret's gender understanding, have little to do with modern advanced gender categories, and actually doesn't really have all that much to do with what we would call a traditional understanding either, those both being rooted in Western European and ultimately Christian traditions. Kingship in Egypt, with its gendered and supernatural components, doesn't map cleanly on our ideas of kingship today. And while we can mostly understand the power and governance aspects well enough, it's all basically the same there, getting deep into the weeds of female gendered kingship in Egypt really exposes the issues here in a way that's hard to encapsulate in a summary video. And actually, it's all really hard to do justice through looking at Tausret's life, since she is so poorly documented. Those interested should investigate Nefertiti and Hatshepsut for more on this. But in the end, more important than her gender while enthroned should be her listing of actual accomplishments. Here, however, things are a bit blank. She did not restart her reign numbering. In Egypt, they of course don't have the modern calendar system of CE and BCE, which for our time counts up from the time of Jesus, and in BCE counts down until the time of Jesus, because of course they didn't know that they should be counting down to a coming Messiah who's 1200 years away at this point. Similarly, they don't count to or from Mohammed as the Islamic calendar does, because Muhammad's not there yet. Instead, they started counting with the reign of each new pharaoh. And so Merneptah died in the year 10 of King Merneptah. Siptah died in year 6 of King Siptah, and so forth. But because Tausret had been co-regent with Siptah, she simply continued her year numbering as if no transition had actually happened, no doubt to make it harder to contest her coronation by presenting it as something that had happened 6 years previously. We only have year names for her from year 6, when Siptah died, up to year 8, and the usual interpretation is that she either died in year 8 or was mostly expelled from power after these 2 years of independent rulership. In those final 2 years, she seems to have had a good bit of resources to throw around. Some damaged records from temples suggest quite significant offerings in this period, which may be a sign of wealth, or it may be a sign of desperation. Similarly, 3 pretty significant hoards of buried treasure have been recovered from either Tausret's reign or just after it, prior to the 20th dynasty restoring order, which are signs both that someone has a lot of wealth, but also that they don't feel secure with it. She may have built a pair of massive temples in the Delta, both of which were later torn down. Not out of apparent malice here, but because stone is quite valuable in that area. There are actually some fairly recent excavations in those temples, and that team has suggested that Tausret may have reigned for a few additional years past the traditional 8. Indeed, it's looking increasingly likely that while she was pretty well defeated throughout most of Egypt by that 8th year, functionally out of the fight at this point, she may have ruled over a small portion of the Delta for perhaps 3 more years, protected by the various branches of the Nile and relatively denser foliage. Things were bad during these final years, whether it was 2 years or 5. Not just for the queen, who seems to have lost both territory and authority pretty quickly, but for the people as well. The banditry and general unrest that had plagued the nation under Siptah only got worse, and foreign invaders seem to have been emboldened by the lack of unity among the Egyptian people. This could well have been when the Canaanite Ersu began attacking, or he could have started pushing into Egyptian lands even prior to this. And likely at around the same time, a fellow who was possibly a grandson of Ramesses the Great, Setnacht, started to get his own armies and establish order, eventually taking the pharaoh's crown for himself. We'll look at both of these men in the next video. But Tausret, much to her credit, and despite the usually masculine character of the Egyptian military, may well have fought against this tide of violence personally. One artwork, badly damaged, survives, which appears to show a queen of Egypt, and given the time period it can only be Tausret, launching arrows in a chariot against another chariot-bound warrior. The opponent's upper body is missing, but from what we can see, he may also be dressed as a pharaoh, indicating that the two may have led troops against each other in some great battle for the throne, the very sort of showdown that often climaxes a good total war campaign. Ultimately, though, we know that Egypt was invaded by Ersu during a general collapse of order and eventually taken over completely by the 20th dynasty. And somewhere in the mix of all that, Tausret perished. Perhaps it was a glorious death in battle, perhaps it was poison in the palace, or perhaps it was simply natural causes, though that last is the least likely. Unlike Chancellor Bey, another notorious schemer, Tausret actually fits into the context of a total war game. She held territories in her own name, was bound to various allied factions only to jump ship when better opportunities arose, and may have led on the battlefield personally at least once. And she is not a token woman character, thrown in on the slightest pretext to increase diversity either. She may not have had much success on the playground of armies and kingdoms, but she was unquestionably a player there, and mostly through clever strategic and diplomatic wrangling, a pretty major one, more significant than some other men who won their positions purely through force of arms. We have no real sense of where on the map it makes sense for her to start her campaign, being as yet unmarried to Seti at game's start. So she should be attached to her father's house and estate, which we can reasonably guess is somewhere in the Egyptian heartland. It looks from the previews like they will be putting her a bit upriver of the capital, which is a likely enough guess. Rumor has her army being given a slight edge in chariot warfare, perhaps on the strength of that one artistic depiction of her in a chariot, but overall her position within the very core of Egypt should see her fielding the most typical of Egyptian armies, without the resource and manpower boost of Seti or the foreign auxiliaries of Amenmessa or Ramesses. A pretty solid pick for a first campaign, especially for those who like to win on the campaign map rather than on the battlefield, and unquestionably a character with a good chance of holding Egypt together under waves of internal conflict and foreign invasion. And so we bid farewell to beloved King Tausret, strong bull, beloved of Ma'at, beautiful as king like Atun, who establishes Egypt and curbs foreign lands, who crushes the foreigners. Daughter of Re, beloved of Amun, mistress of Lower Egypt. Daughter of Re, mistress of the beloved land, beloved of Hathor, lady of the Red Mountain. Lord of appearances, lady of the two lands, founding Egypt and crushing foreigners. The powerful woman, beloved of Mut, Tausret, chosen of Mut. Thank you for watching.